Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Parsons, Deputy Director and Curator for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to be the one to welcome you all here today for our Lunch Bite Object Talk. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, presenting exhibitions and other public programs, advocating for historic preservation, and providing resources to teachers and students. Today's Lunch Bite will feature Andrew Outen discussing a collection of letters written from captivity by William Russell, an American soldier and privateer of the Revolutionary War. Andrew is the Institute's Historical Programs Manager, having joined our staff here at Anderson House in 2021. Prior to that, he spent 9 years as the Director of Education and Museum Services for the Brandywine Battlefield Park Associates. Here at the Institute, Andrew develops our historical programs, including object-based talks like these lunch bites, lectures, authors' talks, panel discussions, battlefield tours, and other special programs. Now, before I turn things over to Andrew, a few housekeeping items for those of you joining us on Zoom. Following the lunch bite, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit your questions for Andrew at any point during the program by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to incorporate your questions with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function. And one of our staff members will be monitoring that and do their best to assist you. Now, without further delay, I want to introduce Andrew Outen.
Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out to Anderson House for today's presentation and for joining us from afar, wherever you may be. Now, before I get started, I have to be quite frank with you. I knew very little about William Russell before I decided to take on this collection of letters and documents pertaining to his experiences throughout the American Revolution. But having spent so much time preparing and researching for today's lunch bite, I honestly wish I had more time to talk about these experiences and the collection, because come to find out, he is a fascinating character with a fascinating story, but I am thrilled to have the opportunity to at least give you a snapshot of that today. To start, there are three main characteristics that you should know about William Russell. One, he was highly educated and extremely literate for his time. He was also ambitious, and in that he was always trying to advance himself both socially and financially. And he was tremendously resilient. And last but certainly not least, he was a man of outstanding character who never once abandoned the obligation that he thought he had or owed to the support of his family. Now, William Russell, just get this going here. There we go. William Russell was born in Boston in 1748 to Samuel and Elizabeth Russell. Samuel Russell was a block maker, an occupation that produced various parts and materials for ships. And when you think of a block maker, just think of the term block and tackle. Samuel was among the many artisans who contributed to the shipbuilding trade within the port of Boston. His mother, Elizabeth Russell, was a teacher who ran a dame school in Boston, which is probably where, beginning at a young age, Russell received his education. His father's trade as a blockmaker was not very lucrative, so Russell decided not to become an artisan like his father. Instead, he followed in his mother's footsteps and eventually went on to become a teacher. Although he couldn't afford to go to college like the Boston elite, by 1770, he secured himself a job at a private school in Boston where he assisted with the supervision of students writing various lessons in reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. It was around this time that he also began to court his future wife, Mary Richardson, who came from a well-established New England family. Unlike the Russells, they were much higher in social status. And as a side note, Mary's father, Moses Richardson, was one of 5 elderly men killed on April 19th, 1775, as the Boston were retreating from Lexington and Concord at a location known as Watson's Corner, right outside of Boston, in the latter part of the day. But I digress. Because of their higher social status, some historians hypothesize that Russell wanted to advance himself socially through his courtship of Mary, but as you will soon come to find out, that it probably wasn't the case, as these two were deeply in love with each other and would go on to have 5 kids together. Now, needless to say, Russell's teaching career and his courtship of Mary were unfolding during a momentous time in Boston. His ambitious mind was completely exposed to the revolutionary movement that was transpiring, and Russell wholeheartedly embraced it. According to family traditions, Russell was associated with the Sons of Liberty in Boston, yet little is known about his involvement. He is also known to have been connected to highly influential Boston revolutionaries, men like Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and others who you will come to learn more of. He is also known to be a participant in the Boston Tea Party, which coincidentally enough is celebrating its 250th anniversary tomorrow. And when I initially threw this on the calendar, I had no intentions of linking the two events, but it is convenient that it all worked out that way, because that event would have a direct impact on Russell and ultimately influenced everything that I'm going to discuss today. Following that momentous event, the Tea Party, Boston began to feel the wrath of the British Crown through its passing of the Coercive Acts. This was meant as a punishment, a direct punishment for the Tea Party, and the Coercive Acts essentially shut down the port of Boston along with other commercial enterprises, brought British troops back to occupy the town, but more drastically caused an increased amount of destitution for the inhabitants of Boston, including Russell and his young family. The first set of documents that from our Russell collections that we're going to look at today reflects what Russell witnessed and experienced following the Tea Party with the implementation of the Coercive Acts, along with the beginning stages of the American Revolution. Here we can see that Russell made note of when the first British regiments arrived in Boston to occupy the town. When he recorded on June 14th, 1774, the 4th Regiment of Foot landed at Boston. They were followed by the 43rd Regiment of Foot the day after, and they encamped on the Boston Common. Almost a year after this, and shortly after the events of Lexington and Concord, when things were really volatile, Russell noted on May 19th, 1775, that he and his family, like many families, fled the city as they went to live with Mary's widowed mother, Mary Richardson, in Cambridge. Almost another year later, on March 17th, 1776, Russell recorded that George's butchers left the town and went on board transports after plundering the town. Finally, as he most likely went back to inspect the state of Boston after the British evacuated, Russell recorded that he entered the town on March 18th before he came out again on March 19th. What he probably found there was nothing good. It was after the British evacuation of Boston that Russell began his military career by enlisting in the Massachusetts Militia and having served in an artillery company commanded by a Colonel Thomas Craft, who was also a well-known revolutionary, so much that it is believed that he and his family actually supplied the Mohawk disguises to the raiders for the Boston Tea Party. Craft's artillery company was assigned to defend Boston, and Russell first served as the company's sergeant major. Russell's career with the militia was probably extremely boring, as there really wasn't much action for him besides administrative and clerical duties, which probably wasn't the most riveting stuff for an ambitious man like Russell. 2 additional documents within the Russell collection are from his service in Craft's artillery company, and they offer a better sense of these boring and mundane tasks. One document is a letter from Colonel Craft to Russell pertaining to his task in assigning men for guard duty when he was sick, and trying to find the substitute because the substitute wasn't getting back to Colonel Craft, and he was going to be potentially facing a court-martial. And the other one is from a Lieutenant William Gordon to Russell at Castle Island, where the key defensive fortification Fort William once stood. And before the British occupation or the evacuation of Boston, the British attempted to destroy Fort William, but the Americans quickly reconstructed another fort and called it Fort Independence. Both forts, William and Independence, were vital in the defense of Boston Harbor. And again, the Craft's artillery were put in various stages throughout the early years of the war on a defensive posting there. It's important to note that Castle Island was also one of the few locations where British prisoners of war were incarcerated throughout the war, along with several prison ships within Boston Harbor. Kraft's artillery again would occupy Fort Independence at various points throughout Russell's militia service. All in all, really all you have to take away from Russell's experiences as a militia officer, there wasn't much action aside from an unsuccessful attempt to assist with the Franco-American siege of Newport, Rhode Island. Russell's service as a soldier, again, was very mundane. But more importantly, it really didn't pay well, at least not well enough for Russell to keep serving. And after filing several grievances that were unsatisfied, Russell and some of his fellow non-commissioned officers resigned in February of 1779. So now Russell, who was desperate for some source of income to support his refugee family, still living in Cambridge with Mary's mother, and he was forced to do something that a lot of New England men did in times of struggle during the war, and that was to try their hand at privateering. Although it was common for New England men to do this, to put to sea as a privateer, it was uncommon for someone like Russell to do this, who was 31 years old at the time, a former school teacher, and absolutely had no experience as a privateer or a mariner for that matter before this. He quickly had to prove himself capable, and he in fact did so. So he joined the crew of the Jason, which was an 18-gun frigate commanded by Captain John Manley, who was a well-respected mariner and naval officer within the fledgling Continental Navy. Being highly literate and having clerical experience after doing this in Kraft's artillery company, Russell served as Captain Manley's clerk on board the Jason. Russell's first experience on the Jason was a rousing success. After setting sail from Boston on June 19, 1779, the Jason quickly captured 2 British vessels as prizes and was back in Boston Harbor by June 26th. So within the matter of a week, Russell's career as a privateer had proven more successful, more lucrative, and probably more exciting than his long career as a soldier was. Which probably made him feel pretty good about the career change and his abilities to support his family. It didn't take long for the Jason to set sail again on June 30th. So they were back at sea, back at it again. But this expedition, however, would prove Russell's initial hopes false. As aside from capturing a British privateer on September 8th, the Jason experienced very little success or little action on this go around. Later in the voyage, however, on the morning of September 30th, the Jason suddenly found itself being pursued by a larger and faster Royal Navy frigate, the HMS Surprise, off the coast of Newfoundland. And this is a picture of the HMS Surprise at anchor. All day, the Jason attempted to outrun its pursuer, but to no avail. By 8 p.m., the Surprise had closed in and ordered the Jason's surrender, to which Captain Manley replied with something along the lines of "Fire and be damned." What ensued was a fierce clash, resulting in the defeat and capture of Jason, and suddenly Russell, along with his surviving crewmates, quickly found themselves prisoners of the Royal Navy. Russell's next destination depended on where the capture occurred. Typically, prisoners taken by the Royal Navy at sea during the Revolution were taken to one of 2 places, England or New York. If they were captured in the North Atlantic or off the coast of Europe, they would go to England. If they were captured in American waters or the Caribbean, they were taken to New York. So Russell, as he was captured off the coast of Newfoundland, his destination was in fact England, where he would be incarcerated at Mill Prison, located in Plymouth. So the next set of documents that we'll examine from the Russell collection relate to Russell's imprisonment at Mill Prison, and this first set are his commitment papers. These papers show William Russell's charge, which is high treason committed on the high seas, and being found in arms, levying war in rebellion, and aiding the king's enemies. It also notes that he would indeed be sent to Mill Prison, which is described as being one of the places appointed for confinement of such prisoners by his said majesty under his royal signed manual in pursuance of an act of parliament, in that case made and provided in the 17th year of his high reign. Now that line, it would be very important, and it would have a profound effect on Russell's imprisonment. Because when the war broke out, British lawyers and policymakers were in a little bit of a pickle when it came to American POWs at sea. Britain didn't recognize the United States, obviously, as a sovereign power. So any captured American sailors were technically prisoners of war, or weren't prisoners of war. They were civilian rebels, or in some cases, as William Russell is charged with, pirates or committing piracy. And as civilian rebels, they were technically falling under the category of civil law rather than military law. If that were the case, legally, captured sailors were susceptible to the rights of any British citizens who would be facing the wrath of British civil law. But the Crown didn't recognize these guys, obviously, as British citizens, nor were they recognized as sailors serving in a recognized nation's navy. So they kind of fell within a gray area at first of British law. This changed, however, on February 6, 1777, when British Prime Minister Lord North brought this matter before Parliament. And within a day, the Secretary of State for the North American Affairs, Lord George Germain, introduced a bill that would solve the problem. On March 3rd, Parliament passed what was referred to as North's Act, an act that stated that any American privateers or Continental or State Navy sailors could be held in prisons, either on land or on ships, and be held on civil charges of treason and piracy. And although they had to be committed to prisons, they went before a magistrate and were committed to prisons, they didn't have to go through a trial, nor did they have the option of bail. So this also virtually eliminated any possibilities of a prisoner exchange. So they were basically secluded to one location for an extended, unknown period of time until something came about the war. As Russell was incarcerated at Mill Prison for 2.5 years, going into detail about his experiences can be the basis of its own lecture. And just to give you an idea of this, in the Boston Public Library's American Revolutionary War manuscript collection, there is a 656-page journal kept by Russell throughout his incarceration at Mill Prison that gives you a meticulously detailed day-by-day account of his experiences. So if you're curious to learn more about that, I suggest you go there, because I'm only going to touch on a small portion of that relate to the collection here. So to give you a broad sense of what life was like for the prisoners in Mill Prison, they were housed in an unsegregated manner, excuse me. They were given clothes and bedding, wash tubs to clean themselves, somewhat decent rations, plenty of time in the prison yard, and even the opportunity to purchase goods such as fruit and other items at the market that was located at the prison's gate. Additionally, on paper, the guards were forbidden to physically abuse them. So this all sounds pretty good, but let's take a closer look to see if all of that is true. Within the Russell collection are 2 letters from Russell to his wife, Mary, from Mill Prison. Russell wrote her first on March 2nd, 1781, and offered a pretty optimistic view of his imprisonment when he wrote that he was in a good state of bodily health, and notwithstanding my long confinement, I have not experienced the want of any necessities of life in this prison, for with my industry and what I am allowed, I live comfortably for a prisoner. The usage we received is very good, for we are allowed the liberty of the yard all day and an open market at the gate to buy or sell from 9 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Besides, we have comfortable lodging, etc. I have never been in the black hole once, nor on half diet, for I have made it a study to behave as a prisoner ought, and am treated in all respects accordingly. Now, Russell's noted industry that he informed Mary of was that of a prison clerk and a teacher. He worked to keep various prison records for prison authorities, and he also set up a school to help educate his fellow inmates. These 2 occupations during his imprisonment allowed him to maintain a good relationship with his fellow prisoners and the prison guards, and historians argue that Russell was a very likable mediator between the 2 factions. So he was a guy who got along with everybody. Russell's second letter, however, offers a more realistic view that conflicts with the optimism from his first letter. Written a month later, on April 11th, Russell wrote to Mary, "You can't imagine the anxiety I have to hear from home, for my spirits are depressed, and I grow melancholy by thinking in what situation you must be in with 3 young children to maintain." According to Russell's day-by-day accounts from his extensive journal, the anxiety and depression that clouded this second letter clouded most of his imprisonment. The collection we are discussing today only holds, again, 2 of the letters of his 30-month and 5-day confinement at Mill Prison. So again, it's just a small sliver that doesn't offer a lot of detail, but when you cross-reference his letters with his detailed journal, you start to see more so a negative pattern going on in the journal. What Russell seemingly witnessed and experienced throughout his long incarceration in reality was a totalitarian rule from the prison authorities, who were quick to punish their prisoners for any infractions. And Russell alludes to 2 of the punishments given to prisoners in his first letter to Mary. The black hole that he notes was a small dark room underneath the prison where the prisoners would be placed for an extended period of time. And combine this with the other punishment, which was prisoners being put on half diet of their already somewhat decent rations that weren't anything to write home about, this could have intense psychological effects. And even though Russell made it his study to behave as a prisoner ought, and was treated well in all respects accordingly, his diary does reflect a tremendous amount of anxiety, depression, and destitution by the end of it all. Unlike what he wrote to Mary in the first letter, he did in fact find himself in want of the necessities of life. On June 3rd, 1782, his 34th birthday, Russell wrote a special diary entry, and he started it by saying, "I have been in this damned prison, destitute of money, and obliged to sell my bread. I am tired and weary of my life." Shortly after that, he continued on to say that he got basically the best birthday present of all, because later that day, a letter from American diplomat William Hodgson arrived. Also, in his letters to Mary, Russell mentions and makes note of several rumors of possible prisoner exchanges that never seemed to come of anything, and that was probably most likely due to the North Act of 1777. Unbeknownst to Russell and his fellow prisoners, however, the Lord North's government saw its end in 1782, and with it, the North Act. The new British government, the Rockingham government, enacted a new piece of legislation that deemed privateers and sailors prisoners of war, which considered them fit for a general prisoner exchange. And Hodgson was authorized by Benjamin Franklin to negotiate an exchange for American prisoners on behalf of the United States. So on June 30th, 1782, William Russell finally boarded a British ship, the Lady's Adventure, and set sail for America. And in his diary, Russell wrote, "I was transported with joy and my deliverance from a loathsome prison where I've been for 30 months and 5 days, and almost despaired for seeing my native country, my loving wife and dear children, or many of my relations and friends who are so dear to me. I've taken my departure from Old Mill Prison, never to see it again." Now, not much is known about or written about his homecoming back to Boston on August 14th, or what, if any, interactions he had with his family, but Russell wrote in his journal that he was in fact destitute of money. And after 2 years, he was in no better of a financial position that he'd been in when he was forced to seek income by joining a privateer crew in 1779. With Mary and their children still living as refugees at Mary's mother's home in Cambridge, Russell was once again compelled to continue his quest to support them, and once again he joined another privateering crew. Like his homecoming from Mill Prison, little is also known about Russell's second privateering adventure. It is known, however, that he was back at sea less than 1 month after returning to Boston, and again quickly found himself as a prisoner of war after the ship he was serving on was captured by the Royal Navy in American waters. And with that, unlike his first experience of being captured, Russell would not be bound for England. Instead, on November 18th, he was taken to one of the most feared places for any American POW in the American Revolution, the infamous prison ship HMS Jersey in New York's Wallabout Bay. The HMS Jersey was a 64-gun Royal Navy warship that arrived in America with German soldiers in 1776. Soon after, it served as a storage ship, then a hospital ship, and was finally converted into a prison ship in 1780. During its conversion to a prison ship, the Jersey was gutted, demasted, and had its rudder temporarily disabled. and all of its guns removed. Its portholes were sealed and replaced with a series of makeshift 20-inch wide windows that were cut in every 10 feet onto the ship's sides and blocked with iron bars. And this is going to be the ventilation system that allowed its prisoners within its decks to gain some ventilation and light. Its quarter deck was blocked off by 10-foot high walls within platforms, with platforms for the guards to walk on, and the Jersey was manned by a crew consisting of a captain, 2 mates, a steward, cook, 12 sailors, and a detachment of guards, 30 guards that would rotate in from New York or Long Island. Now, the remainder of the letters and documents in our Russell collection that we'll be looking at throughout the remainder of the presentation pertain to his imprisonment on the Jersey. It didn't take long for Russell to realize his predicament because 3 days after his arrival, he wrote to Mary on November 21st, informing her that I am now in the worst of places and must suffer if confined to the winter. For I am short of clothing, and the provisions is so scant that it is not enough to keep soul and body together. But my greatest trouble of all is I am afraid that you and the children are in great want, and will be too troublesome for your mother, who I am also greatly concerned. What Russell experienced within those first days was probably, in fact, one of the worst places he had ever seen. Like all the other prisoners that came before him, Russell was transported to the Jersey from New York City by boat. And even before he reached the Jersey, he would have been able to smell the rancid odors emanating from the ship. After processing, Russell was stored in one of 2 decks below the ship's gun decks, which was located deep in the belly of the ship, and they were packed with dozens, sometimes hundreds of other prisoners who were probably covered in lice, sick, or dying. Once more, as Russell noted, he was entirely entering at an entirely terrible time, and this was right before winter. With little clothing, the cold air pouring into these sections of the ship through the small open windows along the sides of the ship was probably unbearable, and the provisions he referred to were equally as abysmal. The scant provisions he referred to were basically putrid beef or pork and bread, and the bread was probably either covered in worms or eaten by worms. The prisoners were assigned to grouped messes consisting of 6 men, and each day a representative for each mess would receive their group's provisions before taking them to the Great Copper, which was a large cauldron that was divided up into 2 sections. One section was dedicated to the cooking of peas and oatmeal, while the other was dedicated for boiling meat. Supervised by the Jersey's cook, the representative would place each piece of meat from the rations in the cauldron, and this would submerge it into the water by a piece of string that had a designated number attached to it. When the cook considered the meat ready, he called the number, and the mess representative would come retrieve his group's food. Now, the water used to boil the meat was generally salt water, which was retrieved from the side of the ship, the same area where the waste produced by the prisoners was being thrown each day. Fresh water was brought in daily by work parties that went ashore, mainly made up of officers, but prisoners were limited to generally 1 pint at a time as fresh water supplies dwindled quickly. 4 days after he first wrote to Mary on the Jersey, Russell wrote to Mary's mother on November 25th. Like Mary, he also informed his mother-in-law of the terrible conditions that the prisoners are suffering, sickly, and dying daily. From this letter, we can see that Russell had already desperately been trying to plan some sort of prisoner exchange for himself as well, as he closes the letter by informing his mother-in-law that he desires Moses to write to me and try to get me exchanged. And Moses is Moses Richardson, Russell's brother-in-law, who we'll take a deeper look at shortly. Following his signature, Russell also makes a special note of his health by writing, "Excuse my writing, for I am very unwell." There we go. Okay. Russell's next letter was written on December 7th to his friend Benjamin Eads. And Eads had served in Craft's artillery company with Russell in Boston. And he is also the person, I should note, that Russell is sending all of these letters to from the Jersey to give to his intended recipients. Eads was not only a member of Craft's artillery crew with Russell, but he was also a very influential person in Boston, as he was also a co-proprietor of the Boston Gazette. So he did have many connections and influence in Boston. He was also an influential Boston revolutionary that Russell would have interacted with well before the war. Eads was known to be a member of the Loyal Nine, who was a secret pre-revolutionary political organization that was formed after the passing of the Stamp Act in 1765, and this was the precursor to the Sons of Liberty, which Eads was also a member of. And Eads was also believed to be one of the masterminds behind the Boston Tea Party. Russell wrote to Eads, essentially begging for his assistance. He says, "Dear friend, I am again, by the fortune of war, thrown into the hands of the enemy, where our scanty allowance is not sufficient enough to support nature. I had the promise of a gentleman's friendship at York to get me paroled in exchange, but find that Admiral Digby is so introverted against privateers, men, that he'll not allow any paroles. Therefore, sir, I must earnestly entreat of you to use your influence," and this is some unreadable text in the letters because of the seal of the letter, influence Major Hopkins to send to Mr. Sprout, commissary prisoners at York, some British prisoner to release me, as I suppose my brother has arrived and brought some in. Desire Moses Richardson not to let any stone be unturned till I am liberated. For if I'm to lay here the winter, I must inevitably suffer, if not perish. When he closed his letter, Russell also asked Eads the following: "As I've no paper, pray write my wife and let her know that I'm very unwell, and desire her to write me with you, and let that be as soon as possible." Like his letter to Mrs. Richardson, Mary's mother, he asked Eads to excuse his writing as well, and notes that his health, that the prisoners are all very sick. Through Russell's letters to Eads, we can extract a lot of important information here. First, we see his desperation. He's using every source that he can think of to get him exchanged. Second, he also asks Eads to have his wife write him as soon as possible. And Russell, at this point, probably knew that he wouldn't make it through the winter, and he wouldn't get another chance to write Mary again. Likewise, a letter from Mary could have also provided a little shimmer of hope for Russell to keep him going, or even more morbid, the fact that that would probably be the last time he ever heard from his wife if she wrote him. Third, we also get an idea of who Moses Richardson was. And from his letters, it appears as though Moses Richardson had been serving in some capacity in the American military, perhaps maybe as an officer, and could have influenced an exchange with the British soldiers who were being held in Boston as prisoners of war. So Moses Richardson was obviously a very important and influential person in Russell's mind. We also finally gain an understanding of how the British officials felt about these prisoners of war. The first being Admiral Digby, the commander for British naval operations in North America, appointed in 1781, didn't really hold privateers in the highest regard. And this can be the same for Mr. Sprout, who Russell notes in his letter. And this is David Sprout, who was a Scottish-born loyalist, handpicked to be the commissary of naval prisoners in New York. Sprout was the one who oversaw all aspects of the prison ships, especially the Jersey, in New York Harbor, and he had a ruthless reputation among the prisoners for purposefully and routinely denying them food, water, and special care and aid. He also denied anybody who attempted to inspect the ships from gaining access to the ships and their conditions. So he made it a point to treat these guys very poorly. And Russell clearly didn't know about Sprout's reputation when he wrote this letter to Eads. In the next letter, we see written to Mary on December 31st, Russell continued to ask for assistance from Moses Richardson. So this Moses Richardson, his brother-in-law, Mary's brother, was, again, somebody very important to Russell, who Russell thought could influence this exchange. He says, "My dear, I desire you to press my brother Moses to try every means to get me from this awful place. For I see no prospect of exchange for me without some person of rank is stopped for me." Now that's important, because it gives us a sense of the hierarchy on the prison ship Jersey. Unlike Mill Prison, there was no there was segregation. In Mill Prison, they were kind of just all, it was like general population. But here on the Jersey, there is a form of hierarchy, and it was basically two factions. You had the officers and all the enlisted men. Now, the officers basically claimed one section of the ship for themselves, and that was in the gun room of the ship. This was where on a normal day for a ship of the line, where the junior officers would gather and use as a mess hall. And this is where the officers claimed for themselves, and they experienced tremendous amounts of comfort there, more so than the enlisted men, who were basically isolated to those two bottom decks of the Jersey. The gun room offered these officers, again, far better conditions, more comfortable conditions that included warmth, better provisions, and rations. The officers made more money so they could bribe the guards. They could bribe the people going ashore, who were often the parties were made up of the officers, to bring back their own food, firewood to cook their own food. They didn't have to go to the Great Copper with the rest of the enlisted men. But probably the most important fact to Russell was it bumped them up the ladder for being exchanged. So the officers had a much better chance of being exchanged than the enlisted men did, which is clearly shown in the December 31st letter to Mary. So with that system of hierarchy in mind, a few weeks after that letter, and I think this is going to change. Is that changing for us? There we go. A few weeks after that letter, written on December 31st, on January 17th, Russell writes to Mary again. He starts by telling Mary of his health. He's unwell. He's sick with a violent cold, but hopes to get better soon. But more importantly, that his situation is greatly altered, and that he was a gentleman where I want nothing but live in the best on the best tea at night and morning, and fresh meat every day. In short, I am like a gentleman in every respect. And this means something for somebody who's trying to socially advance himself through life. But somehow Russell had miraculously made it to the gunroom. He is now among the officers, and was happy, quote, according to Russell, in getting from between the decks and out of that horrid pit where nothing but horror is to be seen. Now, how this happened, we don't know. But things were clearly improving for Russell. Somehow he made it up to the gunroom with somebody influenced his transfer. And they only continued to improve for Russell. At some point between that letter written on January 17th and March 20th, Russell was transferred to the custody of a British ship captain, Michael Humble, and his ship, the Lady's Adventure. And if you remember what the Lady's Adventure was, this, coincidentally enough, was the same ship that transported Russell back from England, where he served that 2.5-year term at Mill Prison. And during that voyage back to Massachusetts, Humble and Russell, although technically enemies, formed a cordial relationship. So the connection there, we don't know exactly how he was transferred, but possibly Captain Humble, Michael Humble, had something to do with it. On March 20th, a Captain Daniel Adams, who could have easily been the captain of Russell's second privateer vessel, boarded the Lady's Adventure with parole papers from Admiral Digby. The parole papers were signed on March 21st by Russell and another prisoner, granting them permission to Connecticut. And the parole papers are actually part of this collection as well. Russell's freedom had finally come after an agonizing 4 years and 2 terms of incarceration. Now we see on March 23rd, Russell is informing Mary of this great news when he wrote from New Haven, Connecticut. He said, "My dear, I'm by the blessing of God once more in the land of freedom and independency for which I fought, bled, and suffered as much as any, without exception, in the continent. On the 20th, Captain Adams came aboard the Lady's Adventure with an order from the Admiral for me, and you can't think the joy I must feel. My captain and friend, my dear true friendship is never known till we are in great adversity, and then experience the assistance of the advocate who steps forward in our defense. Such I have found Captain Adams and Humble to be." So clearly, there was a close connection between Humble and Russell, and again, probably maybe Humble influenced his exchange. But Russell also informed Mary of his next steps. What was he going to do? Captain Adams has been at great cost in getting me from New York, and I've no way to make that gentleman's satisfaction without my remaining on board his vessel with affected. So he's basically saying he owes a great debt to Adams. He thinks he's going to stay. He says our circumstances, he also says our circumstances are such for me to come home with my fingers in my mouth would be of little consolation to those that's been without my help for almost these 4 years. So he knows that he's still no better off than when he went into this whole ordeal or the ordeal in 1779, and he doesn't want to come home empty-handed. Maybe he felt a sense of embarrassment for not being able to provide for his family. He also notes that his health was deteriorating. He says he recovers his health slowly and hopes that the salt water will do what the physician could not effect. So after 4 years of 2 imprisonments, William Russell did not immediately turn home to Mary. He writes one last letter to Mary from afar. Let's see here. Am I going back here? Yep, going back on May 16th, when he says, "I doubt not you think it strange I did not come home, but the fever left me so low I could not stand the fatigue of so long a journey, and at the same time, destitute to support me on the road." So he's not well off at all. He's sick. He felt an obligation to this Captain Adams, and that was his reasoning for not returning to Mary. So Russell did eventually return to Boston that summer, and his fears of returning with nothing to show for his long absence again were met with reality. Throughout his service, he had virtually experienced no success and was seemingly extremely unlucky. On top of that, something that must have eaten away at Russell, who was always trying to again advance himself, both socially and financially. Upon his return, Russell, Mary, and their family continued to live with Mary's mother in Cambridge. Russell attempted to open a school, but his poor health kind of prevented that, and it didn't go anywhere. And this was health that the poor health that he was experiencing as a effect from his time on the Jersey. Never improved, unfortunately, and on March 7, 1784, William Russell died at Mary's home at the young age of 35. So through this collection of documents, letters relating to Russell, we can extract several important lessons. First, and most obviously, they offer us a glimpse into the horrors and experiences of the American prisoners of war during the American Revolution. Second, they offer us a lesson in resilience. Even in his darkest moments, in the poorest health and conditions, William Russell never stopped trying to survive or obtaining his freedom. Third, they offer us a valuable lesson in sacrifice. William Russell gave everything for his country, but most importantly, he gave everything while trying to support his family. Even after being freed from prison, not once, but twice, Russell knew that the destitution his family was experiencing, and he tried everything in his power to remedy that. We can't forget about Mary's sacrifices as well. It's not known whether she ever received Russell's letter, because in that diary entry, he does make note of how he's trying to smuggle these letters out through a Frenchman at Mill Prison, and the guards are taking it from him. So some of his letters aren't getting through. We don't know if she ever attempted to write back. There's no evidence of that. And we can only imagine what she was enduring during his extremely long absence, perhaps not even knowing what her husband was doing, going through, or if he was even alive for that matter. Russell's sacrifice didn't go unnoticed, though. His children, grandchildren, and other descendants surely recognized it. And it is through them and their efforts to continue and perpetuate his story and experiences that we know so much of his experiences during the war. All in all, it's vital that we never forget the reality that this war was won by sacrifices like William Russell and his family. Their stories and their sacrifices represent those of countless numbers of participants, including the prisoners of war and their families during the American Revolution. Sometimes equally horrifying, sometimes not. Without those sacrifices, their resilience, their fortitude, we wouldn't find ourselves anywhere near where we are today, obviously. So with that, thank you. I'll take questions and answer them to the best of my abilities. Yes, sir.
Fascinating discussion, but in the artillery militia, is there any evidence that he and Henry Knox or Richard Ridley, two other famous artillery officers, did they interact with each other? Do you know that?
So the question was, during his service in the artillery company, was there any interaction with artillery officers like Knox or any other well-known figures? The only name that I recognize from the Continental Army was Thomas Proctor. He was, when he went up to Rhode Island to partake in that unsuccessful attempt to lay siege to Newport, it was with John Sullivan, Proctor's artillery. But other than that, I didn't see any interactions with Henry Knox, anyone like that. Yes. It wasn't good. Nothing. The question was, what was his life like at the time of his death? Not much had changed. I mean, he was still experiencing basically poverty. From all accounts that I've been able to read, they were living in the home of Mary Richardson. Things were not looking good for Russell. Nothing ever seemed to get better for him. Yes. So the question was, how did we come across the Russell document, the collection that we have here? This was acquired in 2011 from an auction, and that's the only thing that I know about it. The provenance before that, can't tell. So the question was the descendants, what did they go on to life in life to do? I didn't really look, honestly, I didn't really look into them. But there is one who I think it's the grandchild or the great grandchild who is really the one that's starting to bring Russell's story to the forefront. That's like mid 19th century. I think his name is James Kimball. And he is writing a series of articles and publications that highlighting Russell's experiences. But I didn't really look too much into the descendants. Any other questions? All right, very good. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out, both here and in person and from afar. For those of you in person, feel free. We have all the manuscripts on the table here. And yeah, thanks again.